I guess no two periods are exactly alike, but there is a lot we can learn from financial history and political history. It's kind of a strange combination of I think the 1930s and the 1970s, or at least that's where we're heading. The stock market's hitting new highs every day, and in my view, it's a bubble. A lot of people disagree, and if you said it was a bubble a year ago, but you invested, you made a lot of money last year, so I understand that. But it still looks like a bubble to me. The problem with bubbles is they can go on longer than you think. People say you can't identify a bubble. I disagree. I think bubbles are easy to identify. What's hard is knowing when they're going to pop. And they can go on a lot longer than you think. So you don't want to necessarily run out and short the market, but I don't feel like it's a great time to dive in. But we're definitely in a disinflationary trend with the possibility of deflation and a very severe recession. So that's in the cards. But you have these anomalies, or not anomalies, they're just counter trends, and the price of oil is one of them. But that happened in the late 1970s. The whole Phillips curve idea that there's a measurable reciprocal relationship or inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation is nonsense. It's just not true. The Fed believes it's true, and so you have to understand it if you want to do Fed forecasting, which I do. But the idea is that low unemployment means higher inflation, and high unemployment means lower inflation. Not true. In the 1970s, unemployment was 11% and inflation was 13%, and interest rates were 20%. So tell me that high unemployment means low inflation. It was the opposite. We had high unemployment and high inflation and high interest rates. It was called stagflation, and it lasted, pretty much for most of the period from 1977 to 1981. And the value of the dollar was cut in half in 5 years. You don't have to go back to 1913 and the creation of the Fed and all that. I mean, I know what those numbers are. Here's a period where the value of the dollar was cut in half in 5 years. So at the same time, money supply is decreasing. Velocity has been decreasing for 20 years and is still at a very low level. So the combination of lower money supply and lower velocity means your nominal GDP is ready to fall off a cliff. I talked to Ben Bernanke about this, and in terms of what was going on in the early 30s, my interest was gold specifically, because the narrative or the rumor or the conventional wisdom, I guess, is that gold was a cause of the Great Depression. The gold standard prevented the Fed from doing what it needed to do, and the sooner you got off the gold standard, the faster you came out of the recession, on and on. But Bernanke made his academic reputation long before he became a central banker studying the Great Depression. Probably after Milton Friedman and Schwartz, he's maybe the #1 scholar of the economics of the Great Depression. And I read his book, and it showed that at the time, this is the early 1930s, the base money supply, so M0, could not be more than 250% of the amount of physical gold that the United States had, valued at the market. The market at the time was $20.67 an ounce. So you took the amount of gold times 20.67, which was the dollar price per gold on the gold standard. Whatever that number was, M0 could not be more than 2.5 times that. But in fact, M0 was never more than 100%. It could have been 250%. It was never more than 100%, meaning that the Fed could have more than doubled the money supply under the gold standard without breaking the law. And that's how I read it. That's what the number said. And I said, Mr. Chairman, here's how I read your work. I said, do I understand this correctly? And he said, yeah. I said, so gold was never a constraint. He goes, no. It was the fact that people didn't want to borrow and the banks didn't want to lend. It was a credit issue. But he was very candid about the fact that gold was not the problem in the Great Depression. So we see something like that today, which is M2, which is a different money supply, broader, probably a better. M2 is probably a better reflection of the economy than M0. But M2 is shrinking and velocity is declining. We're not on a gold standard, so you can't blame gold. Whether it was true or not, you can't blame gold because we're simply not on a gold standard. So why are we not hitting on those two cylinders? And the answer is the same reasons during the Great Depression. Banks don't want to lend because they're worried about recession, and people don't want to borrow because they're worried about bubbles or declining commercial real estate values, and they just want to hoard cash. So that's very much of a depression dynamic. So it's a mixed bag. I've said in my books that the U.S. economy has been in a depression since 2007, and then people don't understand that. They go, well, the definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP. There's a little more to it than that, but that's the rule of thumb. So 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP, 2 or more, is a recession. A depression is worse. So a depression must be like 10 quarters of declining GDP or something like that, which of course has not happened. But that's not the definition. The definition of a depression, I take this from John Maynard Keynes, is a sustained period of below trend growth with no tendency to return to trend. In other words, it's depressed growth. You can have growth in a depression. It's just below potential. If your potential is 3.25%, 3.5%, and your actual is 2%, that gap between the 3% and the 2%, which gets wider over time, is depressed growth. And by that measure, yes, we have been in a depression since 2007, and the lost wealth is now, order of magnitude is kind of $5 or $6 trillion, but getting bigger all the time. So I think we're in a depression using that definition. It was good enough for Keynes, it's good enough for me, and with no way out of it, and possibly getting worse. So I would say the U.S. will likely experience a very severe recession. Then the question is, do you get a banking panic on top of that? Because banking panics or financial panics in capital markets or banks are not the same as recessions. They're different things. You can have a recession without a banking panic, as we did in 1990. You can have a financial panic without a recession, as we did in 1998. 2008, we had both. We had a panic and a recession. But we may be in for something like that again. The question is it sustainable? If you have to spend $3 trillion of deficit spending to get $2 trillion of GDP, those are about approximately the numbers, how long can you keep that up? And the answer is, if you have to look at the debt to GDP ratio. If your debt is going up faster than your GDP, your ratio is getting worse, which, according to a lot of great work by Carmen Reinhart and Ken Rogoff, says that you're going to slow growth even more. And the only way out of that, there are kind of 4 ways out: default, restructuring, inflation or hyperinflation, and growth. Well, you can forget growth. We don't have the policy set for that, and the debt to GDP ratio is too high. There's no reason for the U.S. to default or restructure because we print the money. Argentina has to do it. If Argentina prints pesos and borrows in dollars, they can't print dollars, so they do have to restructure or default on their dollar-denominated debt. But the U.S. debt is dollar-denominated, and we print dollars, so there's no reason to default or restructure. But you will get inflation, and I'm not saying this year. In fact, this year will probably be one of disinflation, maybe deflation, but on a longer-term basis, it's the only way out.